Good morning and welcome. In this long lecture, we will discuss how to draft a technical paper. Most of the things that we discuss are applicable to technical papers of all fields. So, when we discuss the typical structural layout of a technical paper, these are the elements that appear in a technical paper. But before that, we should make note that for any technical document, paper is article. So, whether it is a paper or an article or report or thesis dissertation or book, simple and formal language style must be followed. And whatever we discuss in general sense, most of it is applicable to report writing, thesis writing, etc. also. With book, there is a significant amount of difference, but otherwise most of the elements are common. However, there are a few differences. For example, in a thesis dissertation, you will have chapters and there will be sections inside that, while in a paper, the major sectioning elements are sections. So, what is this simple and formal language style that you must follow? So, for that there are several issues here. So, for any the first thing is that formal language should be adhered to, that is standard classical type of language. Classical does not mean 19th century, but what is considered appropriate in a scholastic environment, scholastic communications. And how do you know which kind of language is called formal language for that purpose? So, those journals which are highly respected and standard journals, the typical language followed in those journals in good papers, this is the formal language. And most textbooks also, most good quality textbooks also follow that formal language. And some elements of that follow. For example, colloquial is to be avoided. You will write did not, cannot in full rather than didn't, can't, etc., which are used for conversation. Okay? Because we do not write dialogues in which this would be fine, we write formal material, right? Then those funny words which are often used in SMS and WhatsApp messages, like because and this and, these also should be followed. Then if you say that we took 30 samples, then you write 30 in 30 numerical, that is fine. However, when you write that there are 2 issues that come out of it, you do not write 2 numerically, you write TWO2. So, these are aspects which have to be kept in mind. Beyond that, the English that you write should be simple. Okay? Why? If you can write very complicated, sophisticated English, then why should you stick to simple English? One good reason is that even if you can write hi-fi sophisticated English, but it is always better to write simple English. That way, first, you will make less mistakes, less slips, and second is that if you write simple English, then your readership will be high, which should be the which should be the purpose, which should be the intention of any author. Because the paper that you communicate, the thesis that you submit, if there are more readers to that, then your purpose of writing that paper, that thesis gets served better. And if you write complicated, so-called sophisticated ornamental English in your papers, then many people will not understand it, and therefore, they will not get the gist of your work. So, that way writing simple English is a good idea, and one should avoid bombasts. Quite often some people use long sentences with very big mouthful words, which are only very rarely used, and through which sometimes people try to impress the audience or the reader that what great English they are dishing out, but that should be avoided to the extent possible. Okay? Because here the purpose is not literary, purpose is communication. Okay? For similar reasons, one should avoid long winding sentences. Wherever 2 or 3 simple sentences, smaller sentences, simple sentence does not mean here grammatically simple sentence, what is called simple sentence. 2 or 3, if 2 or 3 smaller sentences which are easier to understand communicate the idea sufficiently well, then there is typically no need to resort to a very long sentence. However, there are situations when long sentences may be needed for correct and better expression. So, you need to use them once in a while. When you do, then you should exercise care that even somebody not so accomplished in English can follow the sense of your communication. So, this is important, and their punctuations etc., punctuation marks etc., come proper handy, and you have to make appropriate use of them. Coming to punctuation marks, one needs to use special care to use correct punctuation in their documents. And here I am listing out particularly those issues in which I have found many people making mistakes. So, for example, space should be after comma or semicolon, not before. This is one mistake which many people make. Okay. Then citations and figure, table, equation, these references should not be put inside parentheses or inside brackets if they are part of the sentence. For example, if you are writing that figure 7.2 shows something something, or figure 5 shows something, figure 7.2 in a dissertation, figure 5 is in a paper. So, if you want to write figure 5 shows such and such thing, or these results are shown in figure 7, then that figure 7 or figure 5 should not come inside parentheses, because it is part of the sentence. On the other hand, if you say that these results have been established earlier, and then you refer your sentence, your equation 5.2 or equation 7, that should be inside parentheses, because otherwise that is not part of the sentence. Okay? So, whatever is part of a sentence, that should not go inside parentheses or inside bracket. This is one point where I have found many people making mistakes. Another thing in which, another aspect in which I have found more mistakes among students is the failure to understand that an equation is often a part of a sentence. Okay? So, for example, when you write that the famous Blasius equation is, then you write the equation. After that equation, you need a full stop, because in place of that equation, suppose something else comes, box. Okay? So, that box, after that full stop comes. Wherever the punctuation sign is necessary in a normal sentence, the equation or inequality expression, those things being part of the sentence, they also should be given appropriate punctuation signs. Then you write the governing equations are these things. Then below that you write where alpha equal to this, beta equal to this. Now, before coming to the next line where you will write where, at the end of the equations there should be a comma or semicolon, okay, as you would normally write if the sentence is free flowing. Okay. So, these are things which need to be exercised with care, and you have to put particular emphasis, you have to put particular attention to these things, otherwise these are things which people quite often miss. Then another important issue is colons and dashes. So, whenever you use a colon, there is apparently a gross tendency to overuse colons and dashes. For example, the relationship between kappa and mu can be expressed as, then you are giving an equation. After as, many people put a colon. There is absolutely no need. If you read the sentence normally, so the relationship is expressed as something something. There is no need of colon. So, in place of that something, an equation comes, that does not change anything. Okay. So, whatever the normal sentence structure has, that should be there in the case of equations also. Okay. Then again coming to languages, one should avoid undue use of display, ornamentation, irony, metaphor, any figures of speech or tricky expressions, because again we are trying to transmit, we are trying to communicate truth and fact and results. We are not trying to really create literary pieces, okay, where those things might be interesting. Okay. So, here in technical communications, one should focus on factual things rather than these ornamentations. Now, another important or rather big item of formal language style is the passive voice. So far as actions of the authors are concerned, the communication should be typically made in passive voice. While speaking, you may or may not follow that to the letter, but while writing in a thesis or in a paper, typically passive voice should be used in such situations. Not that all the sentences of the document should be in passive voice, that is not meant, but whenever the actions of the authors are specifically mentioned, there the passive voice should be used. For example, rather than telling again and again, I did this, we took so many samples, we conducted this experiment, it is considered more polite and smooth if you say that 30 samples were taken and this experiment was conducted, results were recorded in this manner and so on, avoiding the use of I and we, which are considered in some sense to be arrogant. In particular, the use of I should be specifically avoided. Okay. Use of we also can be avoided to the extent possible, but sometimes one uses we. And in this context, I would like to mention the two senses in which the word we is used. One is where by we, one is first person we, in which it is simply the plural of I, that is the group of authors or the group of speakers. Okay. So, for example, if you take a team and go to another place, then you introduce yourselves as we have come from such and such place, that is we. On the other hand, after introductions are over, when you want to say now we will play, this we is not just plural of I, not just plural of first person plural. Here the speaker and listener are taken together. Okay. So, in this inclusive sense, you can use the word we as much as you want. For example, in textbooks you might have seen in many situations that the author writes, let us take a beaker, let us put some water in that. The author apparently draws the reader with himself, and author and reader together form that we. In that sense, the use of we is perfectly all right, and there is no bar against that. On the other hand, when by we you are talking about authors only, then to the extent possible it should be avoided. If it is a single author document, if it is a single author paper, then actually you cannot use we for author, because it is a single author. And then if you want to write it in active voice, then you have to use I, which is specifically avoided. We is still tolerated to some extent. So, there are two senses of use of we. Okay? So, in the inclusive sense, there is no loss of politeness or sophistication. In the only first person plural sense, you should not use it too much. Typically, while referring to oneself, one should use the present authors rather than I. Okay? if he is forced to write in active voice, okay? Or somehow the mention to oneself comes in any context. The present author, I said, if it is a case of single author. Okay? In multiple authors case, you will write the present authors. Okay? Now, another important issue that has to be borne in mind is that thesis dissertations are by their very definition single author documents. Okay? So, their use of authors is totally wrong. Use of we also in the first person plural sense is meaningless. Okay? Use of we in first person plural can be made when the author is talking about the research group, okay, rather than oneself alone. Okay? So, use of we also should be avoided unless allusion is made to the working group rather than alone the author. Okay? And one has to always keep in mind that a thesis dissertation is a single author document. Okay? There is a series supervisor, there is a research guide, thesis guide, but he is not the author of the thesis. In fact, he is going to be an examiner. Okay? He is going to be one of the typical first set of targeted readers. Okay? Now, there is a difference between what you mean by authors and what you mean by the present authors in some situations. Sometimes in some contexts, when you say authors, the meaning is clear that you are talking about yourselves. In some other contexts where you have been just talking about some other paper, in that context authors may mean those authors, the authors of that paper. And in that context, if you have to talk about yourselves, then you have to say the present authors, that is authors of this present document, this present paper which the reader is just now reading. Okay? So, one has to use care to exercise to write these things appropriately. Why I am mentioning these things is that once the tone of several words in sequence sets in the mind, then people sometimes use it in another context also without noticing the underlying difference. One has to guard against that. Now, there is another important issue which will typically come when you present your results and discuss them. Any technical work will typically try to make some claims of achievement, and any technical work will certainly have some limitations in its scope. One important thing is that in any such document, whether it is a paper or a thesis or a report, the scope needs to be delimited very carefully. What this paper is not about, that should be very clear. No wrong impression should be created in the mind of the reader that this particular paper reports solution of some problem or development of some magnitude which does everything in the domain. No paper is really up to that. Okay? So, the limitations should be there in any work and they have to be admitted appropriately. While making claims or pointing out limitations, one has to have a proper balance between truth and some amount of diplomacy also. For example, suppose you are reporting a particular work in a paper and you know that there are two important big limitations to your work. In two wide cases, your method does not succeed in getting you the results. You certainly should not hide that, okay, and you need to point out that there are situations where this kind of problem appears and this method will not be sufficient for whatever reasons you think appropriate. I mean, you need to make it clear. Otherwise, the reader or much before that, the reviewer will get the picture that you are not aware of that issue, okay, which is important. That will actually cause an impression, cause a feeling that your scholarship is limited. So, this paper is not of great significance, you should first understand those things. Okay. So, you should not create that kind of an impression in the mind of the reader, or much before that in the mind of the reviewer, which is very important. Okay. So, if there are limitations, if there are failures in your work, then it should be very clear that you are aware of them. And then it becomes clear that even with those limitations, you are considering it worthy of communication, worthy of publication, to which, whether there is any value or not, the reader or reviewer should concentrate. Okay. However, while you do not hide the limitations of your work, while you point out those limitations clearly, in order to make it clear that you are aware of them, you should not dwell too much on this. For example, suppose you are writing an 8-page paper, you should not write 6 pages of the limitations and criticisms of your paper. That is not exercise of honesty. Okay. Honesty and integrity can be served even if you say that these are the 2-3 limitations of my work, and then you, in good detail, you try to show what the paper does accomplish. Okay. So, this is what I mean, that you need to have a balance between truth and diplomacy, because these 8 pages are dedicated to the achievements made by this paper. Okay. Towards the end, you will point out what else is to be done in future. So, there you point out the limitations of this work. Once you delimit the scope in the beginning, so that the reader does not expect too much, and then at the end you mention what are the things that this paper does not do yet. Okay. So, that will typically appear as the future scope of work in this field, which you might take up in future or somebody else. Okay. At the end, there are two important issues which are very important. First is never plagiarize. Okay. Take special care to avoid inadvertent plagiarism. There are two things. One is, when I say do not plagiarize, then I mean that do not lift things intentionally, do not copy things from somewhere. Okay. So, and how much copying is copying? Even a full sentence, if you take from some other source, that is actually plagiarism enough. You should not do that. That is, in academic circles, that is considered actually something like a crime. Okay. It is against the professional ethics. Now, I said one sentence, an image also comes to that. Now, equations. There are some equations which are widely used. For example, the Maxwell's equations, Navier-Stokes equations. So, you mentioned that these are Navier-Stokes equations and write them. So, there the question of plagiarism does not arise, that you are copying from Navier or Stokes. For that matter, you have not read that paper of Navier and Stokes, original paper, you have read the things in the textbook. Okay. So, that is not the issue, but typically images you should never lift from other sources. And if you need to or if you want to reproduce 1 or 2 sentences from some other source, then the correct way to do that is to use quotations categorically. You can say, as Johnson and Nicholson mentioned, then you put a comma, then in double quotes, perhaps in quote environment, you properly mention that, and then just after that put the citation. Okay. So, that it is very clear that it has been taken from there and they have been quoted. But then do not use this to fill your entire paper with paragraphs and paragraphs of such quotations, okay? Because the paper authored by you should be dedicated to what you are reporting rather than reporting many other things second hand. Okay? Now, take special care to avoid inadvertent plagiarism. Now, this is another thing which you should pay some special attention to. Sometimes it happens that you do not intend plagiarism, but there is something which you read from somewhere, maybe 3 times, you were studying that document very carefully, and some sequence of sentences stayed in your mind properly, I mean continuously, and you, while writing the thing, while writing your formulation, you ended up producing those same sentences. Typically, they will not turn out to be exactly same sentences unless you have a habit of learning things by rote, which is unlikely to be the case. But another way by which such inadvertent plagiarism enter into the writings of many people through a peculiar route which can be actually avoided very easily. What people do when they want to write a document, they collect material which will be used for consultation at the time of writing. Now, just at the time of writing, with the pen in hand or with the keyboard in front of them, they get a little confused about something, and then they want to figure out exactly what is the thing, and then they open the reference to be consulted, and then they understand what is that they are trying to put there, and then just now having seen it there, they just put it as it is. Okay. This is the source of quite a bit of inadvertent plagiarism, and once it enters into your writing, you will never be able to defend that your intention was not wrong. Okay. So, one strategy you can follow regularly as a matter of discipline, that your consultation of other references and your actual drafting of your text can be decoupled in time, okay? And you can lock away the references to be consulted from yourself. How? That means that before writing, you plan properly. You need to give some time, because these communications are time consuming, and whatever research you have done, you need to give at least half of that time for the communication itself. That means, out of the total time spent in your research, 1/3 going into the communication aspect of it is time well spent, because otherwise, if the communication is not proper, then the world at large will not know what great work you have done. So, spending 90% of your time in doing the work, and then at the end in 10% time finishing up the write-up somehow, is a very bad idea of making scholarly communications. So, what I am asking you to do, what I am advising you to do, is to strategize this whole thing appropriately. So, at the time of planning, you have all your references that you want to consult with you, and at that time you make specific note of what are the important things that you need to include. You actually do a proper dry run of your actual writing, what I will write and how I will write it, and in what tone, in what order I will frame this. According to that, you make small bullets, small, just note down equations, then put a note that a figure for this, and then write some more equations. Then you mention 1 or 2 keywords that this has to appear then. Like that, you make a structure, so that following this notebook of yours, following this structure line by line, you can actually dictate the whole paper. You can dictate the whole chapter of your thesis. Once you have done this for the paper, or for the section of a paper, okay, or for a chapter of your book or thesis or whatever, then get rid of all those references and put them away. When you write, when you sit to write, you have only your paper and pen or your laptop and that precious notebook of yours, in which you have made notes for yourself, okay, which do not even have full sentences. So, the question of getting a full sentence copied from somebody else does not at all arise. And now, when you see this notebook, you know what you planned and go on keying in your stuff. Now, you will say that in between, after typing 2.5 pages, then I get confused. What did I mean when I wrote this? Take a break. You deserve that also. Take a break and then take your notebook, go to that other room or at the end of your room to that cupboard where you have locked away all the references, get that reference out and then search the page and oh, this is what I wanted to mention really. And then make a little extra note on the margin of your notebook itself. This is also not full sentence, and come back and continue. Okay? So, actually you did not get your break. So, you should have a cup of coffee at that time, that will give you the proper break and then continue. So, this is the way to take special care to avoid inadvertent plagiarism. Okay? And after you have drafted the whole thing, then again check your own draft for plagiarism rigorously. So, now you treat your own authored document very rigorously like an examiner, like somebody who is out to catch theft. Okay? And everything that you find there which sound to you cliche, okay. So, something which you have heard many times. Okay. Why did I hear it many times? Why do I feel that this is something read many times? So, think from where it might have crept in, okay, and appropriately change it. Maybe something you studied from somewhere which has stayed in your mind, sequence of 3 sentences continuously which you have put by mistake, you have to change them, so that later you attract no blame that you have plagiarized. Okay? So, that means there are 3 stages, there are 3 steps, 3 checks. 1, never intend to lift things which belong to others. Second, make a strategy and follow it with a discipline that you do not by mistake enter it. And third, if you have entered something which sound very familiar, okay, then check that carefully, policing, strict policing on yourself, and then remove them or change them, make it your own. Anything authored by you should have every sentence drafted by you, every image constructed by you. That should be your target. Okay? This is one big issue which you need to do. Another big issue is the issue of proofreading, okay? So, which also needs a lot of discipline. So, of course, you should proofread the thing from top to bottom, maybe at least twice, maybe more times. And one significant part of proofreading is spell check. Okay? So, do not forget to conduct at least 2 rounds of spelling check, at least 2 rounds. Okay? Why at least 2 rounds? Because 1 round of spell check should be by a spell check software. Now that we live in an age where software is there, you should take advantage of it, because many spellings, because of our familiarity with the language and our generosity in condoning the mistakes of our friends and colleagues and all the people around, we have got habituated to some mistakes. So, that way you may not notice some such mistakes in your own writing also. Sometimes if somebody else's writing you are reviewing, there also you might fail to notice some mistakes. So, in your own writing also you might fail to notice some mistakes. A software will catch them ruthlessly. So, there must be 1 round of spell check with a software, but then software will not catch some mistakes, because if the mistaken word in its own right is a valid English word, then spell check software will not notice it. Okay, that is fine as a word. So, in place of from, if you have written for or form, then spell check routine will say fine, because spell check programs are typically not very good in English. Okay, they are good at spellings. There are nowadays softwares for grammar check also, but it is a good idea not to rely on them. You have to use your own grammar check. Okay? So, this is the main points of formal language style and some do's and don'ts which I wanted to communicate to you before going into the actual paper. At this stage, if you have any questions, you can ask.
So, 2 questions. First, how far really the writing aspect of the paper I'm talking about in the context of a paper. The writing of the paper goes to really get it accepted in a journal. I mean, suppose there are two papers which have equally good mathematical content and equally good technical aspects, then how far really the writing goes in terms of getting a paper accepted?
The drafting quality quite often plays a very important role in the future of the paper. I am telling future of the paper, not just concentrating on acceptance, because first of all, your intention to communicate to the reader later and to the reviewer first that it is a valuable work and it is useful gets enhanced by a mature and correct and good drafting. First of all, the reviewer understands it well, and a reviewer typically does not miss the sincere, serious and high quality material, and typically his respect towards the authors goes high, and that also plays a factor in the acceptance of a paper. And if you have given enough care to a proper drafting of your paper, then chances are high that you have not left many gaps, okay, based on which some misunderstandings could be created in the mind of the reviewer. Okay. So, the chance of acceptance of the paper grows with the quality and care that is put in drafting the paper, drafting, proofreading, everything. But you know, the acceptance is only the infancy in the life of a paper. Its real life starts after that. So, those papers which are drafted well, which succeed in communicating its content to the reader. So, when a typical reader starts reading it, he feels that he is getting something out of it. He understands it, he appreciates it, he admires it. So, he reads through the end of it. And that means that the message of the paper goes to the reader. And then that triggers the thoughts, new thoughts in his mind. So, in his new work, he is more likely to use something which he learned from this paper. Whenever you write a paper, you actually intend to teach something to posterity, teach something to your reader. So, when that succeeds, when the reader really learns something and that triggers new thoughts, new ideas in his mind, then when he does something and when he writes, then he is typically more probable to cite your work. Okay. And that point onwards, the real future of your paper starts, and you, if you have drafted your papers very well, which succeeds in communicating your content, your idea, your achievement, your contribution to the readers, then you know, for 20 to 30 years after that, you can, your paper can go on garnering citations for you. And this citation history is actually an enormous asset in the life and career of any academician. So,
yeah, thank you, sir. One more question. You have said many things about how to use passive voices, not to use we. I mean, especially I, and in most cases we also. But there is a completely different view on this. I mean, it may be contentious, but the view is that when you write we, you actually take more ownership. I mean, more onus of the work, more ownership. When you claim ownership of the work, as if you are responsible and you will take all the complaints, or I mean, in future any queries, you will take that, and you have done it. So in that sense, we stands for more emphasis than the passive voice. I mean, what is your comment on that? And many, I must add that many sophisticated and reputed journals also nowadays saying that they actually prefer we sometimes than this passive voice, and there is a lot of debate on that. And what is your take on that?
this debate of active versus passive voice is actually going on for more than a century. In fact, the famous stylists Strunk and White actually specifically ask you to write in active voice. Okay. Now, yes, there are situations where forced use of passive voice makes the communication very artificial. and you should not do that. Okay. Now, that does not mean that you have to use we. Okay. For example, I also mentioned that it does not mean that every sentence of the paper must be in passive voice. Okay. For example, there is a sentence when light strikes a bright wall, then part of it gets reflected. Okay. Part of it gets reflected is passive voice, but when light strikes a wall, how will you write it in passive voice? When a wall is struck by light, nobody does that. Okay. But you see, this is the action of light, which you will happily write in active voice. Okay. But when it is the action of oneself, the style requires you to use it in passive voice. There is a very important reason behind it. Okay. When you say that we conducted this experiment and we collected results, your intention is not to impress upon the reader that the results were so good only because you did it. Okay. You want to basically communicate that when the experiments are when this experiment is conducted under such and such conditions, then results are supposed to be like this. Results are bound to come like this because of some important reason behind. Okay. So, the importance of the agency doing the experiment, the importance of the agency in collecting the results and analyzing them is actually minimal, because you are trying to communicate truth, not magical power of yourself. So, this is why rather than emphasizing on the we aspect of it, the agency of the action, agency of the experiment or calculation or analysis, it is the thing itself which is more important. And if the experiment is conducted under such situations by anybody, your claim is the same results will follow. Okay? So, this is what you are trying to communicate. So, that is why we actually are really unimportant, the facts are important. Okay? So, that is the thing.
So, sir, you are trying to emphasize that in the scientific context, passive voice has a sense of repeatability.
Exactly that.
I mean, that is
Yes.
more than the weakness.
And the facts being impersonal, that is important.
Okay, one thing I wanted to ask regarding citation and plagiarism. So, in our field, in image processing computer vision, we actually have to take images a lot of time. So, in a few papers, I observed that when they take images to work upon or do some processing upon, they mention Google as their source. But this I think should not be a good practice, because Google takes images from a lot of sources, right? However, when there are cases when paper takes some standard images and process upon them, and then suppose I'm doing some another kind of processing, and I want to compare my results with that paper, then I have to take the similar image to show my results. And in that case, then there comes an issue: should I cite the paper for the image, or should I cite Google wherever I take the image from as the proper source? So there's a confusion regarding that. So I would like your comment on this.
Yes, this is an important question actually, because sometimes situations occur when you actually need to report some important image from elsewhere. Okay. When you do that, it is not enough to mention that just in passing in the text or just putting a citation. Okay. For example, I have seen situations where proper plagiarism has been conducted 2 paragraphs continuously or 1 or 2 pages continuously from some other source, and that source is also cited elsewhere. It does not say that these 2 pages are reproduced from there. In the beginning it is cited, it is in the list of references. So, the author is actually, in a way, innocently you can say, or you can say foolishly, giving us the source from where he has stolen. Okay. So, if you take an image from somewhere and mention it in the list of references only, okay, and in the text somewhere you mention in a very less noticeable manner, then you will not be free from the allegation that you are creating a, a passive sense that is also your result. Okay. So, in such situations, you should actually mention it in 3 places. One, in the comparison to your own results, you will write that the image or the result from such and such authors with proper citation has been shown in figure 7.2a, whereas the competing result of our analysis are shown in 7.2b. Okay? This is one place. Second is the list of references where the reference comes. And third, just on the face of the image itself, you put a caption, the result or the image from this source. So, this citation is in 2 places, one at the image site itself and one inside the text, and then there is a third mention at the references. Then you are free from that blame. But even there, there are 2 things which remain. One is that not to fill up your paper too much by such borrowed images. This is one thing. So, that should be minimal, only that much which can be obviously seen to be necessary. And second, to the extent possible, one should create one's own image as long as possible. For example, there is absolutely no case of using the schematic diagram from some other sources. I have seen many people have picked up schematic diagrams from somewhere else. That should never be done because of 2 reasons. One is that it is plagiarism, wholesale blatant plagiarism, which should never be done. And second reason is that that actually cramps the exposition in the current paper, because that schematic diagram might have been a good schematic for those authors to explain the issue in their style. And if you take that schematic diagram from there, then every element of that schematic diagram you will need to explain, and you will never be able to put it across in the proper manner in which that should be handled. So, in such situations, actually you should prepare your own schematic diagrams, whatever labor it takes, because at the time of creating those schematic diagrams, we typically think how I am going to explain it. Okay. This thinking of the explanation, thinking of the description while making the schematic diagram actually enriches the explanation.
Suppose I take some algorithm from a different paper. So, even if the algorithm is exactly similar as that paper, should I write the whole algorithm by?
I typically put it in my own notation, because it rarely happens that I am ready to accept his notation bag and baggage. Okay. So, I typically put the thing in my own notation, and sometimes in my own phraseology also. Okay. So, because some of the aspects which I consider more important, okay. So, I put it in my own style, but then I mention that the algorithm is essentially whatever those authors reported in such and such paper. That is it. Okay.